History remembers her eyeliner more than her intellect. But Cleopatra wasn't a footnote in Caesar's history. She was a force in her own right. A polyglot queen, a master strategist, a mother fighting for survival. So why have we reduced her to a trope? This isn't the Cleopatra of Hollywood. This is the woman an empire feared, and the world still misunderstands. Welcome to episode 17 of Gateway Books by Crestance, the Memoirs of Cleopatra and the Making of a Legend. I'm your host, Cindy Cruz, and this podcast is built on a simple idea, that stories open doors. Each episode begins with a work of historical fiction and walks through the gateway it opens, into the real history, the buried truths, and the echoes still felt today. Today, we turn our attention to Cleopatra, one of the most enduring figures in world history, and one of the most misunderstood. She ruled a fading dynasty, navigated a world of conquest and betrayal, and left behind a legacy tangled both in admiration and propaganda. We'll begin with The Memoirs of Cleopatra by Margaret George, an intimate and sweeping novel that restores Cleopatra's voice. Then we'll turn to Cleopatra, A Life by Stacy Schiff, a sharp, scholarly biography that dismantles centuries of myth. Finally, we'll explore how film, television, and popular culture have reshaped her image in The Reception of Cleopatra in the Age of Mass Media. If you enjoy conversations that live at the intersection of story and history, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. You can find all past episodes and book-inspired gear and decor at crestance.com. Let's begin. She was only a child when she watched her father crown one of her brothers. That moment stayed with her, not because she longed for the crown itself, but because of what it revealed. In the game of dynasties, lineage alone wasn't enough. You had to be chosen. You had to be useful. And above all, you had to survive long enough to matter. From the start, Cleopatra understood that proximity to power could either elevate you or erase you. As one of the many royal children born to Ptolemy XII, she wasn't the obvious heir. But she was the one who listened, who learned, who watched the tides of favor shift like sand. While others indulged in courtly excess, she studied languages, history, mathematics. She read philosophy in Greek and poetry in Egyptian. And though most around her had long since abandoned the local tongue, she insisted on mastering it. Because if she were ever to rule Egypt, she needed to know more than how to wear a crown. She needed to belong to the people who lived there. Margaret George's The Memoirs of Cleopatra doesn't rush us towards her rise. It invites us to linger in the years when Cleopatra was still learning what it meant to be visible and invisible, still finding her voice in a court that preferred women silent, or better yet, married off. She isn't yet the woman of legend here. She is a daughter mourning her mother's death. A sister, treading carefully among siblings who might one day become enemies. A girl aware that her father's grip on power is slipping. And when exile comes, as it so often did in Ptolemaic politics, she sees it not as a humiliation, but as an education. Rome is no longer just a distant force. It is a living, breathing empire with its own ambitions and appetites. She studies it, measures its players, learns its values, and what it fears. By the time her father regains the throne with Roman backing, Cleopatra is no longer a child. She has witnessed enough betrayal to understand the cost of trust. When her father dies and names her co-ruler with her younger brother, she does what any survivor of palace intrigue would do. She keeps her guard up and her circle small. But her brother's advisors see her intelligence as a threat, and soon she is forced into exile again. That should have been the end of her. Another footnote queen in a long line of discarded dynasties. But Cleopatra doesn't disappear. She returns, not with an army, but with a plan, and with a Roman at her side. The meeting with Julius Caesar is iconic for a reason. And the Memoirs of Cleopatra leans into the drama without reducing her to seduction. Yes, she wraps herself in a carpet, but not because she is coquettish. because she is calculated. She knows spectacle matters. And she knows Caesar doesn't just want a queen. He wants a partner who understands politics, strategy, and legacy. What George does so well is allow us to see that Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar wasn't just a love story. It was a negotiation between empires. She speaks to him in Greek and Latin, and when needed, in silence. He respects her not because of her beauty, though that myth persists, but because of her mind. She revives Egypt's economy, stabilizes its food supply, and brings order to a court long plagued by chaos. Together they are powerful, but even as she walks beside him, she is never under the illusion that Rome will love her as its own. Their time together ends in tragedy, not just for him, but for the dreams she allowed herself to imagine. A united empire, a son raised in both traditions, a future where she wouldn't have to fight for legitimacy. But Caesar's death reminds her that in Rome, even gods bleed. Still, she doesn't collapse. She regroups. And then comes Antony. In the hands of lesser writers in Hollywood, Cleopatra's connection with Mark Antony is painted in garish strokes. Lust, manipulation, downfall. But George gives us something quieter, more intimate. Two weary rulers, each battered by loss, finding in each other not just passion, but understanding. She has known ambition that corrodes, grief that lingers, power that isolates. So has he. They build something together, not perfect, but real. Children, a shared vision, a political alliance that threatens Rome's balance of power. And for a while, it works. But power never forgets a threat. Rome turns against them, and Cleopatra finds herself fighting a war in two fronts, one in the battlefield, and one in the stories already being written about her. George's Cleopatra sees the way the narrative is shifting. She knows what it means to be branded a temptress, a foreign queen, an enemy of the Republic. She knows that women, especially powerful women, are never afforded complexity in defeat. And still, she fights. For her children, for her people, for the version of herself that refuses to vanish into myth. Her final days are written with restraint and aching clarity. There is no melodrama in her death, only resolve. The choice to die on her own terms is not romanticized. It is a refusal to be paraded through the streets of Rome, a rejection of the spectacle others want to make of her. And yet, the spectacle happens anyway. Because history has always had a way of silencing inconvenient women and turning the rest into symbols. Cleopatra became a cautionary tale, a seductress, a scandal, rarely a strategist, rarely a mother, rarely a ruler who reigned for over 2 decades in a world designed to erase her. But in the Memoirs of Cleopatra, Margaret George gives her a voice. Not a perfect voice, not an easy one, but a voice that speaks from the wound and the wisdom, from the hunger for power and the cost of holding it, from the tightrope walk of being brilliant and female in a world that punishes both. This isn't the Cleopatra of legend. This is the woman the empire feared, and we are finally listening. We've seen Cleopatra from the inside, through her imagined voice, her ambition, her fears. But historical fiction always leaves space between the lines, a space that biography steps into with evidence, analysis, and argument. So now we shift lenses, from Margaret George's richly imagined interiority to Stacy Schiff's forensic reconstruction, from Cleopatra the storyteller to Cleopatra the strategist. What changes when we strip away the myth and search for the woman underneath? She may have stepped into the world stage in theatrical fashion, but Stacy Schiff reminds us that Cleopatra didn't need drama to be fascinating. In Cleopatra, a Life, the Queen of Egypt emerges from the fog of Western myth and Orientalist fantasy with her sharp intellect, political foresight, and extraordinary command of image and influence intact. And while Margaret George gave us Cleopatra from the inside out, personal, visceral, imagined, Schiff reconstructs her through fragments, footnotes, and centuries of narrative distortion, showing us just how much the record doesn't say, and what that silence has allowed us to assume. The Cleopatra we meet here is born not just into royalty, but into peril. Her father, Ptolemy XII, no less flatteringly as Politis, or the flute player, owed his throne less to public favor than to Roman intervention. That set the tone. The Ptolemaic dynasty was already on shaky ground. Greek rulers in an Egyptian land clinging to legitimacy through incestuous marriages, divine claims, and brutal power plays. Schiff makes it clear that Cleopatra's childhood was not one of pampered innocence. Her education would have been rigorous: math, astronomy, philosophy, and language. She likely spoke half a dozen tongues and was the first in her line to ever bother learning Egyptian. From the beginning, she was marked by precocity and survival instinct. When her father dies and Cleopatra ascends to the throne alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, she is only 18 years old. Schiff doesn't romanticize this power. The title may have been shared, but the authority wasn't. Cleopatra was forced into exile within a few short years, a move that, rather than signaling defeat, revealed her keen sense for timing and strategy. She would return not with vengeance, but with calculation. Enter Julius Caesar. This is the part of Cleopatra's history that books often render in dramatic shorthand: the carpet, the seduction, the affair. But Schiff insists we not take the shorthand at face value. Yes, Cleopatra did famously meet Caesar in Alexandria while hiding from her brother's regime. Yes, their relationship was both romantic and political. But the imbalance in how this relationship has been remembered says more about the lens of history than about Cleopatra herself. Schiff points out how Roman writers, always eager to undermine foreign women, painted Cleopatra as a siren, a manipulator, a destroyer of men. But what the record actually shows is a woman who negotiated with power, knew her leverage, and understood how to align with Rome without disappearing under its weight. Her time with Caesar was not frivolous. Together they stabilized Egypt's throne, restored order, and had a son, Caesarion, whom Cleopatra promoted as Caesar's rightful heir, a claim that terrified Rome's political establishment. Schiff brings nuance to this period, showing Cleopatra not as a love-struck queen, but as a ruler who understood how rare proximity to Rome's center of gravity really was, and how to use it. But it's after Caesar's assassination that Cleopatra's political genius is truly tested. In a world reeling from Caesar's death, Cleopatra had to navigate Rome's civil war with precision. This wasn't just about alliances, it was about survival. When she aligned herself with Mark Antony, it wasn't for romance alone. Schiff portrays their relationship as layered: part passion, part pragmatism, part sheer defiance of Octavian. Cleopatra brought more than love into the equation. She brought a navy, gold, grain, and a reputation that made Rome uneasy. Schiff dismantles the idea that she corrupted Antony. If anything, she argues, Antony needed Cleopatra far more than she needed him. Still, the propaganda war was relentless. Octavian, rising through cunning and inheritance, used every tool available to paint Cleopatra as a threat. Not because she was Egyptian, she was after all Greek, but because she was foreign, female, powerful. Schiff reminds us how thoroughly Rome conflated morality with empire. Cleopatra, with her wealth and wit and refusal to cower, had to be portrayed as unnatural, dangerous. The snake story, the lavish spectacles, the perfume-drenched seductions. So much of the image we've inherited comes from Roman smear campaigns. The irony? Octavian's own sister had been married to Mark Antony, but it was Cleopatra who bore the shame. And yet, for a while, she and Antony built something that seemed almost invincible. They lived and ruled from Alexandria, styled themselves as gods, had 3 children together. But the tide was turning. When the war against Octavian climaxed at the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra's fleet was outmaneuvered. Schiff notes that her decision to flee mid-battle, a move long maligned, was likely agreed upon in advance. She had to protect the capital, her children, her legacy. It didn't work. After their defeat, Antony died by suicide, and Cleopatra followed, famously, mysteriously. Schiff is careful here. She doesn't take the asp myth at face value. Poison is more plausible, possibly planned, possibly assisted. What matters more is what Cleopatra refused to give Octavian, the satisfaction of dragging her through the streets in a Roman triumph. She wrote her own ending. And then she disappeared. Her memory was picked over, recast, politicized. Schiff devotes the final stretch of her book to this afterlife, the Roman distortions, the Elizabeth Taylor glamour, the eroticization and exoticization of a woman who was, at her core, a stateswoman, a ruler, a strategist, a survivor. And in Schiff's view, one of the most misunderstood figures in Western history. What Cleopatra, a life, accomplishes is not just a rebalancing of historical scales. It's a reckoning. Schiff doesn't claim to know every detail of Cleopatra's mind or every step of her path. But she asks us to read between the lines, to question the accounts handed down by those who had every reason to fear and diminish her. It's not just what was written, it's who wrote it and why. Cleopatra's life may have ended behind closed doors in Alexandria, but her story was just beginning. The woman herself disappeared, her tomb lost, her voice silenced. Yet her image never stopped speaking. What followed in the centuries after her death wasn't history, it was reinvention. Rome reshaped her into a cautionary tale. The Renaissance painted her as a tragic seductress. Hollywood draped her in gold and eyeliner. And somewhere in all that spectacle, the woman got lost. In our final book, we move beyond the facts of her reign and into the echo chamber of her afterlife, a place where myth, media, and imagination take turns rewriting the queen we thought we knew. Cleopatra has been dead for more than 2,000 years, but she's never been more visible. She has appeared on canvas, coin, and costume. She's been the subject of operas, ballets, perfume ads, fashion runways, drag performances, school plays, and multiple big-budget Hollywood films. She's been interpreted, reinterpreted, and flattened into a dozen roles. The femme fatale, the tragic lover, the exotic queen, the cunning manipulator. But what happens when a real woman's legacy is buried beneath 2 millennia of imagination? The Reception of Cleopatra in the age of mass media doesn't tell the story of Cleopatra's life. It tells the story of what we've made of her. It's not just a study in how she's been portrayed, it's an examination of why. And as we flip through centuries of visual and narrative retellings, the pattern becomes clear. Each era gets the Cleopatra it needs. In the 19th century, at the height of European imperialism, she was a sultry symbol of the Orient, an embodiment of colonial fantasies about the East, beautiful, dangerous, and ultimately doomed. Hollywood picked up that thread and ran with it. The 1963 epic Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor, remains one of the most expensive films ever made. A spectacle of jewels, eyeliner, and sexual intrigue that said more about Cold War glamour than ancient Egypt. Taylor's Cleopatra wasn't a politician, or linguist, or strategist. She was a star. And stars, by definition, must shine brighter than the story around them. But even as these portrayals captivated audiences, they did something more insidious. They replaced complexity with caricature. Cleopatra became a trope before she was even a woman. She was no longer the last pharaoh of Egypt, fighting to remain independent in the face of Roman expansion. She was a cautionary tale about ambition, about female power, about the cost of being desirable and intelligent in a world that punishes both. The book lays out the contradiction with precision. Cleopatra is the most famous woman from antiquity, yet almost everything we know about her was written by men who outlived her, often men whose interests were in undermining her. Roman historians had little incentive to portray her sympathetically. She was the enemy queen, the foreign temptress, and so her legacy was seeded with bias from the start. Mass media didn't invent this distortion, it just broadcast it louder. That's not to say all modern portrayals are inaccurate or harmful. Some offer nuanced takes, recentering Cleopatra's intellect, multilingualism, and political skill. Others use her as a kind of canvas, a way to explore shifting ideas about race, gender, and power. The book highlights how each interpretation, whether in film, literature, or fashion, reveals more about the era that produced it than about Cleopatra herself. In the age of mass media, representation is power, and Cleopatra's reception reveals how that power has often been wielded against historical women, shaping them into ideals, fantasies, or threats, depending on what the moment demands. She becomes a dangerous other when control is at stake, the fallen beauty when tragedy sells, the exotic queen when allure is needed. Rarely, she is just a ruler, a mother, a human being. This final segment of our exploration invites us to sit with discomfort, because even now, even in our so-called enlightened age, we're still packaging Cleopatra in memes, in movies, and TikToks. We are still deciding how she gets to be remembered. And that's the quiet brilliance of this book. It's not just asking us to pick a definitive Cleopatra. It's asking us to ask better questions. Who gets to write history? Who gets to be remembered? And how do we as readers, consumers, and storytellers participate in the myths we inherit? If Margaret George gave us the imagined interiority of a queen, and Stacy Schiff offered the rigor of a biographer pulling apart propaganda, this final work shows us the echo chamber, the reflection of a reflection, where the original is all but gone. And yet, we keep returning to her. Because Cleopatra isn't just a figure from history. She's a mirror, a myth, a measure of how each generation negotiates beauty, power, and the threat of an uncontainable woman. Cleopatra has survived more than just the fall of her kingdom. She survived centuries of conquest, centuries of male historians, centuries of being flattened, glamorized, misunderstood. Somehow, she remains, at once elusive and ever-present, a woman both overexposed and underseen. She draws us in with drama, with power, with spectacle. But stay a little longer. Sit with the fiction, then the history, then the reflection, and she starts to become something else. Not a goddess, not a siren, but a person navigating impossible odds. A woman making choices, sometimes strategic, sometimes desperate. A ruler trained in diplomacy, forced to wield allure because that's what her world allowed. A mother trying to survive long enough for her children to inherit a future. These books remind us that behind every myth is a person, behind every empire, a story, and behind every image we've inherited, on a coin, on a painting, on a costume, there's a set of decisions about what to include and what to erase. Cleopatra wasn't the last of the Ptolemies because she was seductive. She was the last one because she was outnumbered, outarmed, surrounded by an empire that could rewrite the ending. But she left traces, enough that centuries later, we're still trying to see her clearly. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into Cleopatra. Not just the legend, but the strategist, the survivor, the storyteller. If this episode left you thinking differently about history, power, or the stories we tell about women who lead, I hope you'll give it a like, leave a comment, and share it with a fellow reader. You can subscribe for more episodes where historical fiction and real fiction meet. And if you'd like to bring a little of that reading into your daily life, visit Crestance.com. We've got gifts and gear for book lovers, all inspired by the worlds we explore here. Until next time, may your narratives be nuanced, your rulers unforgettable, and your next read just as bold. See you soon.